Everyone knows that Jesus Christ is the centerpiece of the worldwide Christian faith. What is not so well known is the almost universal effort undertaken by critics and skeptics to try and demonstrate not so much that Jesus' teachings were wrong, but that he never even existed. The overriding question asked by theologians, scholars, and skeptics for hundreds of years has been simply, was there an itinerant Jewish preacher that challenged both the might of Rome and the power of the Jewish Sanhedrin 2,000 years ago? Is Jesus Christ the living Son of God, or is he merely a glamorized invention? If it's the latter, somehow his followers have managed to sustain an amazingly popular fiction for over 2,000 years. But popularity is not necessarily a sign of historical accuracy, and the historical record regarding a man named Jesus Christ has been the subject of controversy for 20 centuries. What is there about the life of Christ that drives critics and skeptics to try and prove he never lived at all? Have archaeological discoveries uncovered a living Christ, or just a mythical Jesus? Is there any historical, archaeological, or scientific confirmation that this man actually lived and grew to manhood in the obscure Judean village of Nazareth? Or is it possible that Nazareth didn't even exist until 2 or 3 centuries after the birth of Christ? 20th and even 21st century discoveries provide some surprising conclusions. In a moment, we'll see if we can find the answers. What little we think we know about the life and the brief ministry of Jesus Christ is primarily contained in a record called the Synoptic Gospels, here in the New Testament of the Bible. But the question is persistently asked, was there really a man called Jesus Christ? And if there was, what was there about this one man living in an isolated corner of the globe that still manages to inflame the passions of a worldwide religious following today? Is it even possible to determine if the record is factual? Is there available historical and scientific evidence to support the fantastic claims the New Testament makes about the life of Jesus of Nazareth? There is one indisputable fact about the life of Jesus that everyone accepts. That is that the vast majority of everything we know today about the life of Jesus is gleaned from the New Testament. But is there other available historical evidence that supports the Bible's authenticity?
The best evidence that Jesus was a real historical character does not come so much from his followers and disciples, but from those who rejected him. His own Jewish people, the rabbis, from the 2nd to 5th centuries, wrote about Jesus, wrote about his death, wrote about his miracles, wrote about his disciples, wrote about their death, wrote about their miracles. That's evidence that's reliable.
Critics would be well advised to avoid attacking the integrity of the New Testament documents. More than 5,000 copies are still in existence today of the New Testament or some portion of it, which is almost 40 times more than we have for any other ancient document. The number of manuscripts preserved of part or all of the New Testament and the number of quotations in the early writers of the Church's history that we have of the New Testament is so numerous that we almost certainly have the correct reading for every doubtful passage in one of those manuscripts, a fact which probably can be affirmed of no other ancient document.
If scholars, archaeologists, theologians, and historians are ever going to know for certain whether Jesus actually walked the earth, certain questions will have to be answered. The New Testament, of course, provides the great bulk of evidence regarding the life of Jesus, and, rightly or wrongly, religious documents are held to be suspect simply because they are religious documents. Surprisingly, theologians seem to have more trouble with these documents than historians. Be that as it may, if we are to glean the truth from the available record, at least 3 questions must be considered. First, how soon after the events in question were the records made? Second, how reliable are those who kept the record? And third, are there independent sources that confirm or contradict the history? The surprising answers when we come back. Quite probably, a majority of the world's people are willing to accept Jesus of Nazareth as a great moral teacher. However, a smaller percentage accept Jesus as anything more than that. Many still dispute that he ever lived at all. Could it be due to the fact that, according to those who recorded his life and ministry here on earth, he makes such fantastic claims for himself? Is there any way, 2,000 years after the fact, that science or scholarship can verify those claims?
For much of the 20th century, biblical scholars confidently maintained that the Gospels and Acts in their entirety did not exist before the 3rd or 4th decade of the 2nd century of this era. In other words, more than 100 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. This view was not based on historical evidence, documentary evidence. It was based primarily on philosophical preconceptions, even though plenty of evidence existed in the last century that the Gospels were written shortly after the death of Jesus. Now the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that the Gospels and Acts were completed in the mid to late 1st century of this era.
Scholars with over 25,000 manuscripts or portions of the New Testament still in existence to work with have in the New Testament record an enormous amount of documentation produced within 30 to 40 years of the actual event.
The claims Jesus makes for himself far surpass those made by any other man. The details of his life are so open to scrutiny that he is either a megalomaniac or he is exactly who he claims to be. The record may have been made by Matthew, Luke, or John, but there is no doubt as to who is speaking. In Matthew 28:18 he says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Luke tells us in chapter 22, verse 69, that Christ said, "From now on the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." In John 6, verse 35, Jesus says, "I am the bread of life." In chapter 9 of John he says, "While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." And in chapter 10 of John he says, "I and the Father are one." Either the disciples were liars and Jesus was a complete charlatan, or he was exactly what he said he was, the Son of God. He doesn't allow us any other alternatives.
If in fact the mainline seminaries have for over a century been teaching that Christ did not claim to be the light of the world and the Son of God, how can that be reconciled with the words of the gospel writers themselves? Luke, for example, is very forthright in establishing his criterion for writing his gospel. Peter also states very plainly that he and the other disciples were there in person. John also takes the time to point out that he is writing from the perspective of an eyewitness, and that his testimony is true. Luke also reminds the readers of his text that they themselves were witnesses to the events described. According to the testimony of the men who wrote the record, then, they were either eyewitnesses or transcribing the words of those who were actual participants in the events of Jesus' life. And they seem to recognize that those to whom they are speaking were also participants and witnesses that would hardly seem possible 100 or 150 years after the fact.
There's reason to believe that the authors of the New Testament Gospels were highly reliable in what they recorded of the life of Jesus. They lived in a world that prided itself on great feats of memorization, that took great pains to preserve the traditions of people believed important in the founding of a religion or a philosophy. And Jesus' disciples certainly cherished him in a way that would have meant they would have been very eager to carefully preserve the words of his deeds and life.
Still, what do we know of these men? Are their testimonies reliable? According to long-standing Christian tradition, Luke was a well-educated Greek physician and companion of Paul, who tells us he undertook an intensive study of all the events surrounding Jesus' life before writing about them. Mark, the companion of Peter, also indicates a great reverence for detail in his record, devoting his efforts totally to recording Peter's eyewitness account of the life of Jesus. Matthew, in fact, appears on every list of Jesus' disciples, and John's Gospel, while different in content and construction, is likewise the product of one who was there with Jesus from the beginning of his ministry, and in fact, John lived longer than any of them. According to Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons in 180 A.D., quote, "So firm is the ground upon which these Gospels rest, that the very heretics themselves bear witness to them." Was the good bishop speaking metaphorically? Or are there non-biblical sources that attest to the fact that Jesus was a very real historical figure?
The writings of Flavius Josephus, the well-known first-century Jewish historian, confirm that Jesus existed. They refer to James as the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and describe how he was stoned by the Sanhedrin. There are other much briefer references to Jesus in non-Christian historians, in such Roman writers as Thallus, Suetonius, and Tacitus, in a Greek historian like Lucian. And the later Jewish documents that make up the Talmud have several references to Christ, including to his miracles and exorcisms. But interestingly, because they did not believe he was God's Messiah, they attribute his power to the devil and not to God, but they do not attempt to deny that he worked these miracles.
Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman historian who confirms that Jesus was crucified as a criminal under Pontius Pilate. He also tells us that Christianity had its origins in ancient Judea. Christians grew to a vast multitude in Rome itself, in spite of the fact that their founder was executed as a criminal. Suetonius was an official historian of Rome during the reign of Emperor Trajan. Among other things, his writings confirm Luke's statement in Acts 18:2 regarding the expulsion of Jews from Rome by the Emperor Claudius. He also makes it clear that there were a significant number of Christians living in Rome before the mid-60s AD. The writings of Roman governor Pliny the Younger are particularly interesting in view of the teachings presented in the New Testament. According to Pliny, the Christians were a people who loved the truth at any cost. He wrote that they met on a certain day, before it was light, singing a hymn to Christ as to a god, and were bound by an oath not to sin. Pliny the Younger did not know what to think of all this. In fact, the remarkable thing is his comment that true believers cannot be forced to worship either the emperor or other gods.
It hardly seems likely that people such as these would take upon themselves an oath and willingly die for something they knew to be a lie. But is it only the ancient historians that support the biblical account?
Modern science also takes a hand in confirming the Gospels, even when the source is secular and often unsympathetic to Christianity. For example, one of the most miraculous aspects of the crucifixion was the darkness that covered the Lamb from the 6th to the 9th hour. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three, record the event. But so did several secular historians, among them a man named Thallus, who lived and wrote in 52 AD, or approximately the same time the Gospels were being written. Critics might argue that Matthew, Mark, and Luke fabricated the whole darkness episode to suit their own purposes. But if so, why would Thallus, a Syrian and a secular historian who was alive at the time, confirm it? And it should be pointed out that these historical witnesses come from original sources.
If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John can be relied upon, and if it can be demonstrated that the account was written well within the 1st century, and if there is corroborating historical evidence from non-biblical sources, can our modern sciences add anything to the weight of the argument? Are there more modern scientific discoveries that tend to support or contradict the notion that Christ lived?
types of things which archaeology can confirm or corroborate have consistently demonstrated the accuracy of the gospel accounts. The pools of Siloam and Bethesda described in the Gospel of John were excavated in the 1890s and discovered to be exactly as the Gospels describe them. An inscription referring to Pontius Pilate as the prefect of Judea was discovered in 1963. In the mid-1980s, a fishing boat, very much in the shape and style of those described in the Gospels, was found from the 1st century on the floor of the Sea of Galilee. And as recently as the early 1990s, the tomb of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time of Jesus' death, was also unearthed.
What can we learn from the archaeologists and linguistic scholars who followed a shepherd boy into a long-forgotten cave on the shores of the Dead Sea?
The Qumran community was destroyed in 68 AD by the Romans, but even at this early date, their scrolls may contain references to the New Testament and even Jesus of Nazareth. When the Crucified Messiah scroll was translated, it was considered to be of the utmost and far-reaching significance. This scroll identified the Messiah as the shoot of Jesse, the branch of David, and declared that he was pierced and wounded. This 5-line scroll referred to Isaiah 53, the suffering servant chapter of Isaiah, which identifies the Messiah as one who would suffer for the sins of the people. This is the section of Isaiah that is often heard in Handel's Messiah. He was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. It also identifies the Messiah as the scepter, a leader of the community, and says he was put to death. It would be impossible to imagine a better confirmation of the Gospels in literature outside of the Bible.
Biblical and non-biblical sources alike attest to his ministry, his subsequent trial and crucifixion. There are other questions for which scientists and scholars are still seeking answers, of course, but there's another aspect of this ongoing search for truth that shouldn't be overlooked. So far, nothing has been discovered that contradicts the biblical account.